In 1965, an ironworker walked a steel beam 40 stories above Manhattan with no harness, a cigarette in his mouth, and a beer in his lunchbox. Nobody thought twice. Today, that same man would be fired before the whistle blew, and the company fined thousands. Number 14 on this list was so dangerous that OSHA banned it outright, and number 3 killed more men than falling ever did. Hit that subscribe button and let us count down the 25 unspoken rules every 1960s construction worker followed that would get you fired today. Number 25. You never wore the hard hat until the boss showed up. The hard hat existed. Edward Bullard patented the first one back in 1919, and by the 1960s, most job sites had a stack of them somewhere near the trailer. But wearing one all day marked you as soft. Real men worked bareheaded, leather cap at most, feeling the sun and the sawdust. The hats came out when an inspector rolled up, or when the general contractor walked the site in his good shoes. The men called it hatting up for the suits. A falling wrench from 6 stories could split a skull like a melon, and everyone knew a guy it happened to. But you did not wear the hat to protect your head. You wore it to protect your job from the man who could take it. The second the car left, the hats went back on the nail. Number 24. You brought your own beer and you drank it at lunch. The liquid lunch was not a scandal in 1962. It was Tuesday. A laborer would bring a paper sack with a sandwich and 2 cold ones, or he would send the youngest apprentice on a beer run to the corner tavern with everybody's dimes. Foremen drank too. The idea that alcohol and 30-ton cranes did not mix had simply not entered the culture yet. Men poured beer to cut the dust, to take the edge off a hangover, to get through the afternoon. A bottle cost about $0.25. Nobody breathalyzed anybody. Today, a single beer at lunch on a construction site is grounds for immediate termination and a failed drug and alcohol test that follows you to the next contractor. Back then, refusing a lunchtime beer was the thing that got you looked at funny. Number 23. You smoked wherever you stood, including next to the fuel. Everybody smoked, and everybody smoked everywhere. On the scaffold, in the trench, leaning against an acetylene tank, rolling a cigarette one-handed while the other hand guided a load. Cigarettes were part of the uniform, tucked in a rolled sleeve like a badge. A pack of Luckies cost about 30 cents. The danger was not abstract. Men lit up beside open cans of gasoline, near freshly laid tar, inside half-framed buildings stacked with dry lumber. Grinding sparks and cigarette embers shared the same air. Fires happened. So did explosions. But telling a 1965 tradesman he could not smoke on his own job would have gotten you laughed off the site. Today, one lit cigarette in a restricted zone is a fireable offense and, near the wrong tank, a criminal one. Number 22. You walked the steel with nothing between you and the ground. This is the image everyone knows, and it was real. Iron workers, the men who raised the skeletons of skyscrapers, walked beams 8 inches wide, hundreds of feet in the air with no harness, no net, no tie-off line. They called themselves cowboys of the sky, and the swagger was the whole point. A man who clung to the beam or crawled was finished, socially. You walked upright, hands in your pockets sometimes, to prove you belonged. The Empire State Building went up this way. So did most of the post-war skyline. Falls were the #1 killer in the trade, and every crew had lost somebody. The unspoken rule was simple. You do not tie off, because tying off says you are afraid, and fear gets you shunned. Today, working at height without fall protection is the single most cited OSHA violation in America and an instant dismissal. Number 21. You cut and handled asbestos with your bare hands. In the 1960s, asbestos was a miracle. It insulated pipes, fireproofed steel, lined boilers, and got sprayed onto ceilings in a fluffy white coat. Workers cut it, sawed it, mixed it into cement, and packed it around fittings with their fingers, breathing the dust all day. The fine white powder settled on their arms and in their lungs. Men went home dusted white, and their wives shook it out of their clothes into the same air. Nobody wore a respirator because nobody had told them there was anything to fear. It would take decades and thousands of mesothelioma deaths before the truth surfaced. Today, disturbing asbestos without containment, Negative air machines and full respirators is a federal violation that shuts down entire sites. Back then, it was just insulation, and you handled it like drywall. Number 20. You never wore eye protection because squinting was tougher. Safety glasses were available in the 1960s. They sat in a box in the supply shed, largely untouched. Grinding steel, chipping concrete, driving nails, cutting with a torch. Men did all of it with naked eyes. A face full of grit was a rite of passage, and getting a steel splinter dug out of your eyeball at the end of a shift was a story you told at the bar, not a workplace incident report. Foremen who wore goggles got ribbed. The Unspoken Code held that a man watched what he was doing and did not need glass to protect him from his own work. Eye injuries were staggeringly common, and plenty of men lost sight in one eye over a career. Today, walking a site without safety glasses gets you sent home on the first warning and fired on the second. Number 19. You toughed out the injury and finished the shift. Getting hurt was not a reason to stop working. It was a test. A nail through the boot, a gash across the forearm, a smashed thumb turning black. You wrapped it in a rag, maybe splashed some whiskey on it, and you kept going until quitting time. Reporting an injury meant paperwork, meant looking weak, meant maybe getting a reputation as a man who could not take it. Foremen quietly encouraged this, because a clean safety record made them look good to the higher-ups. Men worked with broken fingers, cracked ribs, and concussions they never named. Serious wounds got stitched at the kitchen table that night. Today, failing to report a workplace injury is not just fireable, it is a liability nightmare that companies drill into every worker on day one. Back then, the man who reported a scratch was the one nobody wanted on the crew. First pattern break. Here is where you have to understand what actually ran these job sites, because it was not the rule book. There was no rule book. OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, did not exist until December of 1970. Before that, a construction site was governed almost entirely by an unwritten code of masculinity, seniority, and silence. The foreman was king, the old-timers were the Supreme Court, and the apprentice was barely a citizen. Safety was not a system. It was a matter of personal reputation, and the reputation you wanted was that of a man who did not complain, did not flinch, and did not need protecting. Every rule on this list flows from that one idea. The danger was not a bug in the culture. It was the whole point of the culture. Toughness was currency, and you spent it every single day just to keep your standing on the crew. Number 18. You climbed the ladder with both hands full. 3 points of contact is the first thing they teach today. In 1963, that would have gotten you called a granny. Men climbed extension ladders 30 feet up, carrying a bucket of mortar in one hand and a hod of bricks on the shoulder, gripping nothing. Some carried a coil of cable in their teeth. The faster you moved material, the more you got done, and the more you got done, the more the foreman liked you. Ladders slid, rungs broke, and men fell with their hands full because they could not grab anything to save themselves. It was one of the most ordinary causes of injury on any site. Nobody footed the ladder for you. Nobody tied it off. You went up fast and full and prayed the rung held. Today, that is an automatic stop work and a write-up that can end your day. Number 17. You never questioned the foreman, ever. The foreman's word was law, and law was not up for discussion. If he told you to go into a trench that looked like it wanted to cave, you went. If he said the scaffold was fine when the planks bounced, it was fine. Questioning an order in front of the crew was close to insubordination, and a foreman who got questioned could make the rest of your season miserable or simply not call you back. There was no anonymous safety hotline, no right to refuse unsafe work, no stop work authority for the man at the bottom. You did what you were told, or you found another site. Today, workers have a federally protected right to refuse dangerous work, and a foreman who punishes a man for raising a safety concern can be sued and fired himself. In 1965, raising the concern was the thing that got you fired. Number 16. You worked in your street clothes and your regular boots. The head-to-toe safety gear of a modern site did not exist as a concept. Men showed up in dungarees, a flannel shirt, and whatever boots they owned, often plain leather work boots with no steel toe and thin soles that a nail went through like paper. High-visibility vests were not a thing. Cut-resistant gloves were not a thing. A man dressed for comfort and for looking like a working man, not for surviving an impact. When a beam dropped on an unprotected foot, toes were lost, and that was accepted as the cost of the trade. Today, steel-toed boots, hard hats, high-visibility gear, and rated gloves are mandatory on nearly every commercial site in the country, and showing up without them means you do not set foot past the gate. Back then, the guy in special safety boots was the guy who got teased in the parking lot. Number 15. You handled lead paint with no mask and no worry. Lead-based paint was standard through the 1960s, and construction and demolition workers lived in clouds of it. Scraping old paint, sanding it, burning it off with torches. The men breathed lead dust and lead fumes every working day. It got on their hands and into their sandwiches. Painters mixed it, sprayed it, and wiped their brushes on their pants. Nobody wore a respirator because the danger was invisible and unspoken. Lead poisoning built up slowly, showing up years later as nerve damage, kidney trouble, and worse, and almost nobody connected the dots at the time. The federal ban on lead paint did not come until 1978. Today, disturbing lead paint requires certified crews, containment, and respirators, and doing it barefaced is a serious violation. In the 60s, it was just painting. Number 14. You rode the crane hook and the load up to the top. This is the one OSHA specifically outlawed. Instead of climbing 10 flights of a half-built tower, men would step onto the crane's hook or ride up sitting on the load itself, a pallet of block or a bundle of steel, and let the operator lift them to where the work was. It saved time and legs. It also meant that if the rigging slipped, the cable snapped, or the operator misjudged, a man rode a 2-ton load straight down. Guys did it every day and thought nothing of it, waving as they swung up past the lower floors. Riding a crane load or its hook is now flatly prohibited under federal law, one of the clearest bright lines in construction safety. A worker who does it today is fired on site, and the operator loses his certification. In 1966, it was just the fast way up. Number 13. You never wore hearing protection, and you paid for it later. Jackhammers, pile drivers, riveting guns, circular saws, and diesel engines made a construction site one of the loudest places a human could stand, and the men stood in it for decades with nothing in their ears. Earplugs were seen as unnecessary and a little ridiculous. The result was an entire generation of tradesmen who went half-deaf by 55 and spent the rest of their lives saying, "What?" at the dinner table. The ringing never stopped for a lot of them. Hearing loss was so universal in the trades that it was treated as a natural part of aging rather than an injury. Today, hearing protection is mandatory above certain decibel levels, and companies do annual hearing tests to prove they are protecting workers. In the 1960s, the deafness was just what happened to old construction men, and everybody accepted it. Number 12. You let the new kid do the most dangerous job to prove himself. Every crew had its rookie, and the rookie earned his place by taking the jobs nobody else wanted. Go down in the deep trench, walk the highest beam, handle the sketchy scaffold, reach into the machine. Hazing was not just accepted, it was structural. The unspoken belief was that a man had to be tested, and the test was danger. Older workers watched to see if the kid flinched. If he did, he was done. If he swallowed his fear and did it, he was in. Plenty of young men got badly hurt or killed, proving something to a crew of men twice their age. Today, deliberately assigning a new or untrained worker to the most hazardous task as a form of initiation is exactly the kind of thing that ends careers and triggers lawsuits. Back then, it was how you became a real member of the crew. Second pattern break. Now, here is the part that people forget when they get nostalgic about the tough old days. The men on these sites were not reckless because they were stupid. They were reckless because the entire system rewarded it and punished the alternative. A worker who insisted on a harness slowed the crew down, and a slow crew cost the foreman money, and a foreman who lost money did not call that worker back. Safety was framed as cowardice, and cowardice cost you your livelihood. The company saved a fortune by not buying equipment, not building nets, not slowing down for precautions, and when a man died, there was often little more than a handshake and a small check for the widow. The danger was not an accident of the era. It was a cost that got quietly pushed off the company's books and onto the workers' bodies. The men paid in fingers, in lungs, in years, so the job could come in cheap and fast. Number 11. You solved your disputes with your fists, and everyone respected it. Conflict on a 1960s site did not go to human resources because there was no human resources. Two men with a problem settled it behind the trailer at lunch, threw a few punches, and usually shook hands after. Foremen looked the other way, and sometimes a foreman settled his own authority the same way. A man who could handle himself earned respect. A man who ran to complain earned contempt. This was seen as the natural order, a rough justice that kept the peace in its own way. Today, a single physical altercation on a job site is grounds for immediate termination for everyone involved, plus possible assault charges and a permanent mark on your record. In 1964, throwing hands to settle a grudge was practically a team-building exercise, and the man who wouldn't fight was the one who lost standing. Number 10. You catcalled and harassed anyone who walked by, and it was tradition. The construction catcall was so ingrained it became a cultural cliché, and in the 1960s it was completely unchecked. Whistling, shouting, and worse at women passing the site was treated as harmless fun, even encouraged as a mark of the crew's swagger. There were essentially no women on the sites themselves, and the culture was aggressively, proudly male. Nobody imagined there could be consequences. Today, that same behavior is textbook sexual harassment, and a worker caught doing it is fired, and the company exposed to serious legal liability. Sites now run harassment training and enforce codes of conduct that would have baffled a 1965 crew. What was once considered just the way construction men acted is now one of the fastest ways to lose your job and your reputation in the entire industry. Number 9. You dug the trench deep and straight down with no shoring. Trench collapses are one of the deadliest hazards in construction, and in the 1960s, men dug them straight-walled, 10 and 12 feet deep, and climbed right in with no shoring, no trench box, no sloped sides. A cubic yard of soil weighs as much as a car, and when a wall let go, it buried a man in seconds and crushed the air out of him before anyone could dig. It happened constantly. Crews just kept digging. The idea of spending money and time to box out a trench before a man entered it was seen as slowing the job for a danger that probably would not happen. Today, protective systems are required for any trench 5 feet or deeper, and sending a man into an unshored trench is one of the most aggressively enforced violations there is. Back then, you jumped in and hoped the dirt held. Number 8. You never called in sick, no matter what. Showing up was everything. A man who called in sick was a man who might not have a spot when he came back, because the foreman could always find another pair of hands at the union hall by 7 a.m. So men came to work with fevers, with the flu, with injuries that should have kept them in bed. They operated heavy machinery while dizzy and sick, endangering themselves and everyone around them because staying home felt like a bigger risk than working hurt. There were no sick days for most laborers, no paid time off, and no safety net beyond the paycheck. You worked or you did not eat. Today, coming to a site visibly impaired or contagious is itself a safety issue that can get you sent home or written up. In 1963, dragging your sick body to the job was proof of your reliability, and staying home was how you lost your place. Number 7. You improvised the scaffold out of whatever was lying around. Engineered, inspected, tagged scaffolding was not the norm. Men built their own platforms out of loose planks laid across barrels, stacked blocks, sawhorses, and whatever lumber was on hand, then loaded it with workers and material, and went to work 3 stories up. If it held this morning, it would hold this afternoon, was the logic. Planks cracked, supports shifted, and the whole rig came down with men on it more often than anyone recorded. There was no competent person inspection, no load rating, no guardrails. You eyeballed it and trusted it. Today, scaffolding must be designed, erected, and inspected by qualified people, tagged for safety and fitted with guardrails, and a worker who throws together an improvised platform is stopped immediately. In the 1960s, improvising the scaffold out of junk was a sign of resourcefulness, not a fireable act of recklessness. Number 6. You took your break sitting on the edge, feet dangling over nothing. The famous photograph of men eating lunch on a beam high above the city was not staged bravado. It was how men actually rested. During breaks, workers sat on the raw edge of an unfinished floor or a beam, boots hanging over a fatal drop, eating a sandwich and shooting the breeze like they were on a park bench. There were no guardrails on open edges, no barriers, no warning lines. A man who dozed off, lost his balance, or leaned back wrong simply fell. It was so normal that nobody thought of it as dangerous. Today, every open edge and floor opening on a site must be guarded, covered, or protected, and a worker caught sitting on an unprotected edge is pulled off it instantly. Back then, the edge was the best seat in the house, and taking it was just part of the workday. Third pattern break. Here is something the numbers make impossible to ignore. In the years before OSHA, roughly 14,000 American workers were dying on the job every single year, and construction was one of the deadliest trades of all. That is not a distant statistic. That is a stadium's worth of men who kissed their families goodbye and did not come home, year after year. And it was so ordinary that most of those deaths never made the papers. When OSHA arrived in 1970 and job site deaths began falling over the following decades, it was not because men suddenly got softer. It was because someone finally decided that a paycheck should not cost a life, and that the unspoken rules of the old sites, the toughness, the silence, the swagger over safety, had been killing people the entire time. Every rule on this list looks quaint until you remember what it actually cost the men who lived by it. Number 5. You breathed the dust, all of it, all day. Silica dust from cutting concrete and stone, wood dust, dust from mixing dry cement, plaster dust, demolition dust. The men breathed all of it with naked lungs. Cutting concrete blocks sent up clouds of fine silica that scarred the lungs into a disease called silicosis, and men worked in it for entire careers without a single mask. A shift ended with your snot running gray and your throat coated. It was seen as part of the work, the taste of a real day. Respirators were rare and mocked. The long-term damage, ruined lungs, chronic breathing trouble, early death, arrived quietly years later and was rarely blamed on the job. Today, silica exposure is tightly regulated. Wet cutting and respirators are required, and a worker cutting concrete dry in a cloud of dust is violating federal law. In the 1960s, the dust was just the smell of getting things built. Number 4. You let kids and family wander onto the active site. A construction site was not the sealed, fenced, hard-hat only zone it is today. Foremen's sons showed up after school to watch and help. Workers brought their kids by on a Saturday to see what Dad was building. Neighborhood boys cut across the site as a shortcut, and nobody chased them off. Untrained, unprotected people, including children, walked among moving equipment, open trenches, and swinging loads. Nobody thought of it as a hazard because the whole culture of controlled site access did not exist. Today, an unauthorized person on an active site is a serious breach, and a worker who brought a child onto one would be fired on the spot for the liability alone. Sites are fenced, badged, and locked down precisely because of everything that used to happen when they were not. Back then, the site was practically part of the neighborhood. Number 3. You worked in the killing heat with no water breaks and no shade. This is the one that took more men than falls ever did, quietly over the years. Crews worked full summer days in heat, ranging from 90 to 100 degrees, pouring hot asphalt, standing on baking rooftops, digging under a blazing sun with no mandated water breaks, no shade tents, no rest periods. Asking to stop for water was seen as weakness. Men pushed through dizziness and cramps and the confusion that comes before heat stroke, and some of them collapsed and died, their deaths written off as heart attacks or bad luck rather than what they were. The toughest thing a man could do was keep working when the heat was trying to kill him, so that is what they did. Today, heat illness prevention with mandatory water, rest, and shade is increasingly the law, and denying a worker water in extreme heat can end a supervisor's career. In the 60s, toughing out the heat was simply expected, and it killed men who never saw it coming. Number 2, you never told the inspector the truth about anything. When a rare inspector or safety man did come around, the entire crew closed ranks. Hats went on, the beer disappeared, the improvised scaffold got a story, and everyone suddenly followed rules they had ignored all week. Nobody volunteered a hazard, nobody reported a near miss, and nobody told an outsider anything that could bring heat down on the foreman or cost the crew hours. Snitching was the ultimate sin, worse than any physical danger. A man who talked to an inspector honestly was finished on that site and blackballed on others. The code of silence protected the company far more than it ever protected the workers. Today, retaliating against a worker for talking to a safety inspector is illegal, and honesty with regulators is protected and encouraged. In 1965, telling the truth to the inspector was the single fastest way to never work in that town again. Number 1. You measured your worth entirely by how much pain you could hide. Every single rule on this list comes back to this one. The unspoken code that ran the 1960s construction site was that a real man never showed that he was scared, never showed that he was hurt, never showed that he was tired, and never, ever asked for anything that looked like protection. You worked hurt, you worked sick, you worked scared and hid it. You breathed the dust, walked the beam, rode the hook, and drank the pain away at night, and you did it all with a face that said, none of it touched you. The men who followed this rule best were the most respected men on the crew, and it cost them their lungs, their hearing, their backs, their fingers, and sometimes their lives. Today, that culture is understood for what it was, a machine that turned human toughness into cheap labor and quiet graves. A modern site that ran on it would be shut down, and its bosses in court. But for the men who built the country's skylines and highways, hiding the pain was not just a rule. It was who they were. Here is my challenge. The next time you drive past a construction site and see the fences, the hard hats, the harnesses, the guardrails, and the water coolers, do not roll your eyes at the caution. Every one of those things is there because a man in the 1960s did it the other way and paid for it. Drop a comment and tell me which of these shocked you most. And if your father or grandfather worked construction back then, ask him what the sites were really like. You might be surprised how many of these rules he lived by, and how casually he'll tell you about the day one of them almost killed him.